So I think it's probably likely that if you're watching this video, you have either heard of Hults Bruk or maybe even own one or more of Hults Bruk's axes or products. The brand is currently owned by Hults, and Hults Bruk claims to be the oldest axe manufacturer in the world today. Although, in truth, they don't specifically claim to be the oldest axe manufacturer in the world today, but through their marketing material and their advertisements and even in their products, they do state manufactured in Sweden since 1697. If that were true, it would make Hults Bruk the oldest axe manufacturer in the world today by several hundred years. I did read in one article online that Hults Bruk has a 200-year head start on any other axe manufacturer. The implication being the longer a company has been making a product, the better that product is going to be, which generally I find is true. However, in reality, that claim is not exactly accurate, and it turns out to be mostly marketing. At least it requires a lot of context. I understand why Hults Bruk wouldn't go out of their way to correct the misconception about manufacturing axes since 1697 and might even flirt with encouraging people to believe that's true. But what I wanted to do with this video and what I try to do with this channel is cut through all of the marketing smoke and mirrors and give people good information to buy quality products at a good value. I don't think Hults Bruk needs to flirt with this, call it statement lacking context, because I think their forging history is impressive enough on its own. So we'll start with the parts of the claim that are true. And this video is going to be very general, very 5,000 foot view. It's going to start with the establishment of facilities in 1697 and go up until about 1900. So starting with the parts of the claim that are true, a factory or a facility, if you want to call it a forge, I suppose that could be true, was established just north of the Swedish city of Norrköping in 1697 by a Dutchman named Jacob Riensterna. At the time, starting a forge or a mine or lots of other heavy industry required a special permit from a central office in Stockholm. Riensterna was a fairly wealthy and connected individual. He had previously been an advisor to the Swedish King Carl XII, and so he obtained that permit and established this production facility north of Norrköping, again in 1697. So that's where that date comes from. Now, when he established this factory or forge, it was exclusively engaged in making nails. And the nails manufactured at this plant were used primarily in the Swedish Navy, but also for other Swedish ships and exported to Norway and a fairly limited geographic region of Northern Europe. So at the time, making nails was fairly profitable. Nail making machines had just been developed and were being improved every year. Prior to these machines, making nails would have been a one-by-one process done by probably a local blacksmith. It was expensive and it was time-consuming, and the supply chains just weren't there to make nails readily available. If you didn't have a blacksmith in your area, you probably didn't have nails. So this facility, this forge, was engaged in making nails to expand shipping. So by 1600, there were some nail-making machines that were starting to be produced. Again, this is about 100 years before the Hults Bruk facility was started. This machine was called the Oliver, and basically it was a somewhat automated process that essentially replicated exactly what a blacksmith would do, produce the same quality nail, same type of nail, except instead of a blacksmith swinging a hammer, it was a machine that swung hammers. By the early 1700s, this had changed. They now had machines that made what we call today cut nails. So they'd take a 2-foot strip of metal, a little bit longer than the length of the nail that you wanted to make, and they would run it through a machine that would run a series of levers first cutting the nail and then eventually putting a head on it. This wasn't really forging as we'd know it today. It wasn't like a blacksmith taking a piece of metal, heating it up, striking it with a hammer. They call it cut nails for a reason, because they might heat up the sheet of metal somewhat, but they were cutting individual nails from a strip of metal to make the end product. So you could call it a forge, I guess, if you wanted to loosely use the term, but it was more akin to a factory. Going forward, Hults Bruk's development was heavily influenced by a series of wars that Sweden and Norway and Denmark and everybody was fighting amongst each other and against Russia. And it was from 1700 to about 1721. During this relevant period, Sweden was engaged in the Great Nordic War. Again, this is a 2-decade war. And Riensterne, having been very close to King Carl XII, who was king at that time during the war, was asked to expand his production line to continue making nails, but also to make anchor chains for ships and chains for other purposes on a ship. So in order to do this, Riensterne was offered some very favorable tax treatment and export treatment. He could now export his products free of duties, and accordingly took advantage to expand the product lines within Hults Bruk. So at this time, during the 1700 to 1721 period, Hults Bruk began making anchor chains, which, according to the company, was their second largest production line up until the end of the 1860s. So that's a century and a half. Now, after Riensterne died, the factory, the license was transferred to a Brigida Walrave, and she ran the forge more or less along the same lines as had been operated by Riensterne for a period of a few decades. After she passed away, her granddaughter ran the forge. Now, during this time, I think it's very likely, and there's some evidence out there, that in addition to the nails and the chains and the anchor chains, that there were some limited quantities of axes and spades and other tools that were being made by the forge. However, it would not have been their primary occupation, and there would not have been significant quantities of these products made. More than likely, the Hults Bruk forge was operating a service for maybe local farmers. That's the way things generally would have been done at the time. Now I'm going to fast forward to 1832, when Magnus Eklund purchased the Hults Bruk forge from the granddaughter of Brigida Walrave. Now at this time, the Industrial Revolution in Europe was well underway, starting in the 1820s. So this is 1832. So they're a little bit behind the ball, but trying to catch up rapidly. Magnus Eklund continued to make nails, but starting in the 1830s, made everything Hults Bruk was making, but expanded into flat irons for ironing clothing, metal garden tables, cook stove, all kinds of things. They were a very general, maybe foundry or forge, because a lot of that would have been cast and not forged. So, skipping forward to, let's go here to 1886. Okay, so I'm going to skip to 1886 when Eklund's grandson, Magnus Eklund, purchases the forge. So in the mid-1880s, the forestry industry in the U.S. had been booming for several decades now. All throughout the 1880s, there was more than 18 million board feet of timber produced every year, and all of this required a steady supply of very high-quality axes. The 1880s was about the time when the crosscut saw was starting to be introduced. So, and this is a reminder for me just how old and established a tool the axe is. Axes, starting in the 1880s, the dominance of the axe started to give way to the crosscut saw. So that, I mean, we're talking 140 years ago. The heyday of the axe is, I mean, we're talking a century and a half ago. It's just incredible. So at the time in the 1880s, there was an enormous need for axes. And Eklund realized this and thought, I'm going to see if I can capitalize on some of that. So he went from Sweden to the United States, to England, and to Belgium. Or he probably went to Belgium, then England, then the United States. And he wanted to study industrial manufacturing techniques. He wanted to understand if there was a way to make money selling axes to these markets. And he just wanted to learn and adapt the forge to be the best forge that it could be. So during his travels, and I imagine he would have gone to the Northeast, and he very likely would have gone to the South. You got to remember in the South, especially Florida, Virginia, Georgia, especially Georgia, the turpentine industry, the naval wares industry was huge. The longleaf pines and the slash pines were huge business for turpentine, for pine tar, for all the things that you would need to protect wooden ships. And Hults Bruk is now reviving their turpentine axe, which they began making in the early 1900s. So I imagine he would have gone to probably Pennsylvania, maybe Connecticut, and then worked his way south. So he engages on all of these travels, and he comes back to Sweden. And he has purchased equipment. He's purchased forging equipment, and I'm sure he has drawings and notes, probably volumes of drawings and notes to establish all of those techniques in Sweden. And at the time, Hults Bruk was not sending axes to the United States, and it doesn't take a whole lot of guessing to know why, because there were hundreds of axe manufacturers in the United States, and the competition was just so fierce. There was no need for a Swedish axe in the United States at the time. It would have been too expensive, and people wouldn't have paid for it. And so his plan, Eklund's plan, was to manufacture axes and send them to New Zealand and Australia. So now, in fairness, Hults Bruk, at the time Eklund went to the U.S. and went to Belgium and England, they were already manufacturing axes. I'm going to put a page here from an 1884 catalog. But if you look at the style of those axes, those are very in the Finnish style, more like the Bilnaz style axes. Once Eklund comes to the, call it industrialized parts of Europe, the style of their axes changes. They lose the sockets. They have more of the lug patterns, and they become more of what we would call a traditional, maybe Western axe today. So just in fairness, I will mention that. But even according to Hults Bruk, their axe manufacturing didn't really start until the late 1870s. So in summary, based on the information provided by Hults Bruk and other inferences based on historical sources, by all accounts, Hults Bruk was very likely making axes in the late 1870s, beyond question by 1884. And after Eklund returned from Belgium and England and the US, they really started their modern axe manufacturing activities. So from 1697, not quite, but yes, Hults Bruk, a very old, continuously operating forge. So I say this not to take any shine off the brand, but just to help people be a little bit more educated with their money and with their purchases. So I hope you found this video informative and entertaining. I've been enjoying making YouTube videos. So if you made it this far, if axes and forestry and tools interest you, I hope you'll hit the subscribe button. I get an email every time somebody does that. I think it's kind of neat. And I also enjoy hearing from people about their experiences and their thoughts on my content, even if it is of a different opinion than the one that I put forth on my videos. So I'd love to hear from you guys. And again, I hope you enjoyed the video and found it entertaining, and if not, at least informative. So thanks again for watching.